Today, we're going to talk about how to build a podcast network. I'm going to give you some insight into the podcast network that I helped build, how we built it, the pros and cons of operating one, and the pros and cons of joining one. Comment, like, subscribe. It all helps the algorithm. I'd also like to say that today's executive producer is Eric Bay. Without Eric Bay's big baller support, I'd probably be hopping from bar to bar, doing bar tricks, betting people $100, maybe $200 if it's a nice town, and tell them, hey, I bet I could drink these 2 pints of beer before you drink that 1 shot of whiskey, but here's the kicker, you can't pick up that shot of whiskey until I put down this first glass of beer. And I drink the first glass, put it over the shot glass, they laugh, I drink the second beer, boom, 100, 200, rinse and repeat across every single bar I could find in that city. Then I move cities, then I move states, then I move countries. But thanks to Eric Bay's Big Baller support, I don't have to do that. And if you would like to be a Big Baller supporter of the show, you can hit the Patreon link in the description below. Welcome to catching you up with... Nope.
Nadav, it's over.
So the podcast network that I worked for was called YMH Studios, and it started with one successful podcast called Your Mom's House with Tom Segura and Christina P. It started in a living room on a couch with shitty cameras and okay enough microphones, which is appropriate as I'm testing this new streaming setup in my place. Bear with me. There's definitely some issues with this, but you know, this is still definitely watchable. But guess what? The ring lights are back, baby! You guys wanted it, I brought it back. The ring lights are here to stay for, as long as I, record in this setup, but we'll see. We'll play that by ear. All right, and that was me checking on my girlfriend because this is the first time I'm recording from home, and that startled her. So, Your Mom's House podcast became undeniably big, and around episode 330, I come along and start recording, editing, and uploading to YouTube. Within a couple years of me joining the team, it didn't matter if there was a guest, it didn't matter if there was no guest. Each episode on YouTube was bringing in hundreds of thousands of views on a weekly basis, and that's not counting the audio numbers on top of that. It outperformed all comparative podcasts minus Joe Rogan, and I'd like to attribute that to the fact that we were one of the early adopters to YouTube, which lets a podcast tap into an algorithm that exposes it to a much wider audience than if you just stayed in audio only, which, I think even to this day, there's no audio only discovery algorithm that lets a podcast get big. If an audio podcast gets big, it's through word of mouth. Remember when Serial came out and the way that you heard about it was that your mom came home from work and was like, "Oi, Nadav, at work, I talked to a friend and she said that there is this podcast, I don't know, it's like internet radio, and she said that it's a show about murder and the intro music is like fling ding 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 ding, and Nadav, you have to listen to it." That's how you heard about podcasts back in the day. Your mom's friend at work. Nah, that's an embellishment. But it started off small and it remained consistent and audience engagement stayed high. The money that it was bringing in from YouTube ads, sponsored ad reads, and merch sales was big. And they started thinking, how do you reinvest into this podcast? We already have a producer that's handling everything. We're recording out of our home. And the answer to that was to launch more podcasts that they either were or weren't a part of, and launching it under the umbrella that is YMH. Kind of like a podcast network. At the point that this decision was made, I had been working with them for about 2 years, and that involved doing some light producing of the show and editing the show and uploading it and doing all that stuff. And that was my side hustle for 2 years as I was working freelance in post-production in Los Angeles. They called me and they said, "Hey, we want to start a network. Multiple podcasts. This only works if you're on board. Are you in?" And I was taking that call on my lunch break while working at a video game content company that was tanking. So that was a very easy yes for me. And I said, yeah. Give me like 4 weeks to transition out of it. So what I did was I immediately gave my 2 weeks notice and then gave myself 2 weeks off from that gig so that I just had 2 weeks of just straight up nothing. Always make sure to build in vacations when you can. So I quit my day job to go all in on becoming the executive producer of this podcast network. And the podcast moved from Tom Segura's and Christina P's home into office/warehouse in a business park in Reseda, California. We built 2 sets, one for YMH and one for all of the other shows. We got some equipment, we triple soundproofed the walls, and we got to business. At this point, I want to say that the subscriber count was somewhere between 500,000 and 750,000, something like that, maybe? Probably closer to 500,000, but I want to say north of that. And our plan for podcast launches were pretty simple. We had a pretty successful YouTube account that had quite a bit of subscribers, and we had ancillary social media accounts like Tom and Christina's where we can make announcements. So if we uploaded something to the YouTube channel and paired it with some social media posts about the new launch that we're doing, all of a sudden a new podcast has a way bigger chance of getting big numbers on the first few episodes than if it just organically sprouted on its own with someone without a following that launched not on a podcast network. And our mentality was, you like our podcast, so if we launch something, you're gonna like that podcast too, because we know what you like. So if you like this, you're gonna like that. It honestly was a solid launch strategy, and it worked for us way more than it didn't. The first initial 3 podcasts that we launched were Dr. Drew After Dark, HoneyDew with Ryan Sickler. We had already been doing Where My Mom's At with Christina P, and we almost did Whiskey Ginger with Andrew Santino. And all those are great podcasts, the ones that are still around and the ones that were discontinued. I'm still very proud of every show that I've produced. And shortly after that, Tom Segura and his best friend Bert Kreischer decided to launch a podcast that they've been talking about for years called Two Bears, One Cave. You might have heard of it. It got successful pretty quickly, and it started as a monthly show, and then it went to twice monthly, and then COVID hit, so it's just like, all right, well, let's ramp this up to every week. Either way, I remember that I shit my pants while producing the first episode, but then COVID happened and it amplified every existing podcast because podcasts were now pretty much the only source of consistent new entertainment that people that were in lockdown were able to actually view. That plus news that said, tell your grandparents you love them because they're going to be not alive soon. And the rest was history. The growth just kept on, was just a consistent growth throughout everything. Man, COVID was a peak time to have podcasts. Don't get me wrong. There are still podcasts that are crushing it right now, but it was much easier to get crazy views during that time. And the rest is history. So what are the pros and cons of starting a podcast network like this? The first pro is that you have the ability of curating content that you know that your fan base is gonna like. Hey, you like this show? You're gonna like every other show that we launch. And if you're able to make good moves, you should be able to detect when there's a good opportunity to launch a new show on your network. Like, hey, there's something here. I think the fans are gonna like this. We should produce this podcast. Plus, you're getting a very sizable revenue split from all these podcasts that you're producing. Because think about it, you are taking care of the entire headache of making a podcast off of people that are on your network. At the podcast network that I ran, all the talent had to do was show up for an hour or two, and then the staff did the rest. It was a turnkey operation. We took a scheduling, we took care of producing, production, post-production, uploads, routing promos to the appropriate people and their guests. But for a while there, the amount of shows that we were producing outnumbered the amount of people we had on staff, which is kind of wild. But I ran a really tight ship, and I made sure to never hire an additional person until it was absolutely necessary. And look, there were some growing pains. Mistakes would happen, and then you'd create protocols that would prevent those mistakes from happening. But there's an endless amount of mistakes to make. And as you install more and more protocols to making sure that the product comes out as good as possible once it's uploaded and released to the audience, each episode now takes significantly a lot more human hours to put out than it did before. But that comes with building an empire. You build and you build and you build. You run into a bottleneck, you solve for the bottleneck, and then you just go back to building again. You're now selling merch, collecting money from ads on each of the shows that you produce. That's pretty solid money, and absolutely covering the overhead that it costs you to run this network. The staff, the equipment, the rent price of the office that you're recording out of. At least it should be. You should not be growing your content media empire unless it's paying for itself. I'm all for investing small sums of money into, trying to create something. But, we're talking about tens of thousands of dollars in overhead. And that's just staff. Then there's equipment, like upgrades, all sorts of things that you need to be paying money for, where, your monthly income from this business absolutely has to cover those costs. Do not grow faster than that. That's some free consulting right there, but if you want some not free consulting, you can go ahead and email me at verynadavshow@gmail.com. Now, what are the cons of running a podcast network? Well, if you don't grow your staff quickly enough, they start getting spread pretty thin. What they used to be able to do very well in their sleep with one show now gets a little bit more difficult when you multiply that by 5. It's doable, but it's a lot of work. Now, remember, during this growth period, this happened like at the start/peak of COVID, and we were living in Los Angeles at the time. So we were living in one of the most scared places of COVID as this was happening, and me included. So whenever someone got COVID, I was like, fuck, we just lost a load-bearing member of the team for the next 10 business days? And right when one person got healthy enough to come back, guess what happened? Another person contracted COVID, and it would just be an endless cycle of this. But I would also like to say we never missed an upload. We don't miss uploads. And I don't know if you've noticed, but I take pride in not missing uploads. Unplanned ones, at least. So that's kind of the blueprint on how I helped build a podcast network, but it all kind of boils down to just making more good decisions in a row than bad decisions. But I think you could kind of apply that logic to anything. Now, for the next part of this video is, should you join a podcast network? In the long run, probably not. Building a dependency on a third party to make your content is kind of a dangerous position to put yourself in. There's just inherent risk involved. You are not in the driver's seat of what you're able and not able to do. Yes, production services solves a big headache for a lot of podcasters, but it doesn't prime the podcast to be successful. You need butts in seats, or the equivalent of that in podcasts. Remember how I told you earlier in the episode that the way that a podcast would normally get popular is through word of mouth? You'd hear about it from your mom's friend at work. Launching a podcast on a pre-existing subscriber base is so much more efficient than your mom's friend at work. Distribution leads to views, impressions, and downloads. And that is what sells ads on your show. And that's what brings you money. The other thing to consider is that you're working on someone else's schedule. Like, yeah, I ran a tight ship and scheduling was figured out weeks, if not months in advance. But if you don't have a dedicated closed off space for each podcast and a designated staff for each of those podcasts, you can't record simultaneously. So all it takes is one host saying they need to reschedule something or push something by an hour, or, hey, can we do this tomorrow instead of today? That now throws a disgustingly huge wrench in very delicate gears. It just causes a ripple effect or chain reaction that now affects every single podcast that's recorded for the rest of the week. And let me tell you, part of producing is managing expectations. So there were definitely occasions where someone's like, hey, I need to reschedule XYZ. I'd be like, okay, well, there's no wiggle room here. So if you want to go down for a week, you could do that. But the time that we slotted for you is what we have slotted for you. And if you can't make it, then we'll have to go dark for a week. And unfortunately for you, we don't miss uploads. So whatever came up, make that go down. Producing's hard. You gotta have some uncomfortable conversations sometimes, but for the greater good. What the fuck is that from? Is that Toy Story? But look, if you're a good producer, you'll still make it work somehow. But the other con of joining a podcast network is you're now getting a significantly larger chunk taken out of your revenue pie. Because in exchange for production services, scheduling, post-production, like all of it, you're giving up a more significant slice of your pie. Now, as a side note, there are so many models that are similar to what I just explained, but executed completely different. Like there's Gas Digital, which is home to Real Ass Podcast, Legion of Skanks, Story Wars, The Reg, so many great shows. And they launch so many new podcasts on a regular basis, but they're centralized behind a paywall on their website instead of in a publicly facing YouTube channel, which their YouTube channels keep on getting deactivated and closed and banned, and yet they still manage to operate, which is crazy to me. That's a whole other way to skin this cat, and it's an impressive way to do it too. And then there's companies like Barstool Sports that seem to be launching so many different podcasts, but it's almost like they're a launch pad for pirate ships that don't leave the dock, if that makes any sense. Maybe I'll try and get some people from those camps to interview on the show and kind of get a better idea of how and why that company operates the way that it does. But until then, I hope you liked this episode. I'd like to thank all the people that you're seeing on screen right now. Without their help, it'd be hard to put this show up on a consistent weekly basis as good and as well as I do. And if you'd like to become a producer of the show, you can go ahead and click the Patreon link in the description below. Now's a good time to remind you again to comment, like, and subscribe. It all helps the algorithm. But most importantly, I'd like to remind you,
This is a totally unconfirmed news.
see you next week.